So, Stadia just had a very controversial launch. There are tech issues as well as pricing issues, and people are wondering if Stadia is already dead on arrival. I have my own opinions on it, so let's talk about it. A few days ago, Google launched their first streaming platform. It is a new competitor in the gaming world. It's going to try and compete with the consoles, with your PlayStation and your Xbox and whatnot, and it has released, and already early on in the market there have been big issues. I also want to talk a bit about my problems with the Stadia today. People have already been making loads of videos about issues with their Stadia, about how they properly play, about how there are issues with latency, about issues with the Chromecast heating up. Today I kind of want to talk about, is the Stadia dead, or do I think people are already being hyperbolic near launch? Let's take a look at history, let's take a look at the actual facts, and then I'll give my own opinion later on. I want to talk about two problems today. I want to talk about how the Stadia does not live up to its own marketing, some technical issues. I want to then after that talk about the pricing issues with the Stadia, and I also want to cover a bit of the history. Let's talk about false promises first. Google said that they would release the Stadia playing at a native 4K 60 frames per second with very little latency. As it turns out, that is not exactly what happened, and people are kind of mad about it. It's kind of weird.
In the same areas of the same games. The idea here is that by matching the same actions from system to system, we can build up a picture of relative latency from a local experience to a cloud-delivered version. One further caveat, there can be variations in latency response between platforms running the same code, something I've noticed to be especially true of Unreal Engine games. Probably the most useful comparison then is Shadow the Tomb Raider on Stadia, which offers up a 30 FPS high resolution mode and a 60 frames per second performance alternative, and those two modes are present on both Stadia and Xbox One X. Results here indicate a delta of 50 to 56 milliseconds between the local and cloud-powered experiences. But what's really surprising here is the variance between 30 frames per second and 60 FPS modes on both systems. That's a whole lot of extra lag for halving the frame rate.
And people are kind of mad about it. It's kind of weird because Google didn't technically promise that every single game would run at a native 4K 60 FPS, but they did put it in their marketing that it would run at 4K 60 FPS. So if they had been more specific about which games would be 4K 60 FPS, probably a part of this shitstorm could have been avoided. Then there is obviously also the latency. Now, Digital Foundry has already made a video on the latency. I strongly recommend everybody to watch that video. They have done some testing, and as it turns out, if you have a pretty decent internet connection, you can actually play games at a pretty consistent 60 frames per second on the Google Stadia. However, there is a pretty heavy built-in lag of about 140 milliseconds, depending on the title. And because of that, the actual gaming experience isn't as smooth as you'd maybe want. So to actually give some context, as you'll see from the footage in the background, most console games on the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, let alone PC gaming, they actually have less lag as compared to the Stadia. And it's not even like less lag if you're both running at 60 frames per second, no. If you look at a game like Destiny 2, which runs at 30 FPS on the consoles, it actually has less lag than the Stadia playing at 60 frames per second. So what you're getting with the Stadia is an experience where the image, if it is running at 60 FPS, is nice to your eyes, but how it actually feels to play, the input latency, is worse as compared to playing on 30 frames per second. The second problem I want to cover today has to do with the actual pricing of the Stadia. Now, the actual entry price of the Stadia, if you have a Founder's Kit, would be 130 euros for 3 months of premium, and then after that you have to pay 10 euros or $10, whatever currency you have, a month to keep on being part of this premium subscription. And for this premium subscription you get some extra features, and among other things, games are a bit cheaper. Those are the benefits that you get. However, in my opinion, this entry price is kind of steep even though 130 euros or dollars is a lot cheaper than buying an actual console. The actual games that are available on the Stadia are mostly games that have already been released on the PlayStation and Xbox and the PC years ago. And these games are either much cheaper for sale, like 20 euros or dollars, or maybe 30 at most. And some games are even free, like Destiny is right now. And then on the Stadia, meanwhile, they are almost full price if you're part of the premium service, where they are about 40 euros, or they are entirely full price if you are just part of the normal service of Stadia. Couple that with an actual controller, which costs about 70 euros, and the actual price starts to stack up pretty quickly. So what you're essentially getting right now is a platform which has not lived up to its own promises in performance, which has had pricing issues with games being much more expensive on the Stadia, even though the actual gaming experience is not as good. And especially for these older games, being near to full price again is kind of ridiculous. As well as some other technical issues regarding the Google Chromecast heating up. Whether or not that is a large issue that affects a lot of different Stadia hardware out there, I do not know. There are not yet enough Stadias in the market to see whether or not this is a very common occurrence, like the red ring of death was on the Xbox 360, or perhaps the yellow light of death on the PlayStation 3. So let's talk a bit about the actual history of streaming devices, and after that I'll get to my final point for this video. Whether or not I believe Stadia is doomed to fail, or what I believe will happen. Frankly speaking, the Stadia is not the first streaming device on the market. If you look back at 2012-ish, there were two other platforms that wanted to do a similar thing. These were OnLive and later on Gaikai. Now OnLive was the first attempt, I believe, and back in the day when it did game streaming, it had an input latency of about 150 milliseconds, but it could already play games at 60 frames per second. Very similar to the Stadia then, in that sense. However, the actual input lag from the OnLive platform was much more variable per games as compared to the Stadia. Stadia is much more closely stuck to 140 milliseconds of lag, whereas OnLive would stick between 150 up to 200 milliseconds of lag, input lag, and that is just when the actual frames per second were consistent, which OnLive wasn't. OnLive had a lot of frame drops compared to Stadia, compared to console games at the time. Games like Batman would run notably worse. On top of that also, OnLive was 720p. It's not full HD like 1080p, let alone 4K, but you know, it's close enough. It was about the image quality standard. But as compared to Stadia, which has fairly clear imaging, which does actually render at a native 4K, OnLive had to go through multiple compressions because the actual internet infrastructure at the time was a lot worse as compared to now. Not to mention that Google has a lot more improved and a lot better servers as compared to OnLive back in the day. So because of that, the actual compression from the servers onto your monitor, the actual image quality of OnLive was much worse as compared to a true native 720p image. These people who used to run OnLive have sold their patents to Sony, and the people who used to be Gaikai have now turned into the people who run PlayStation Now for the PlayStation 4 hardware. So let's start business size and why this is important. If you look at other hardware that struggled near the beginning, particularly the PlayStation 3, but let's also talk a little bit about the Xbox 360. It at the time was the first HD console on the market in about 2005. And the Xbox 360 had some pretty big launching issues because, frankly, it had very few games to make it unique. The thing that kind of carried the momentum of the Xbox 360 in the early days was the fact that it had HD graphics, which nothing else really did, except for some pretty powerful PCs, which PC gaming at the time was still very small. So then if we move to the PlayStation 3, a much worse case scenario of the same problem, it launched in 2006 and it basically had no big games to carry it into the market. There was very little hype because of that. Even though it is the big successor to the PlayStation 2, the best sold console of all time, the PlayStation 3 really suffered in its first few years. It only had Resistance in 2006, Heavenly Sword in 2007, and in about 2008, where I myself got my PlayStation 3, it really only started to boom then. And the PlayStation 3 really struggled back then because it was a far too expensive product that didn't really deliver the quality that it was promising to the consumers, much like the Stadia now. However, what carried the PlayStation 3 to become a success eventually is the fact that Sony invested a lot of money into making exclusive games. Not just that, but Sony decided to take a bigger loss on its PlayStation 3 system hardware by reducing the price. So Sony already made a loss per unit produced, and they actually decided to increase their loss per unit produced by reducing the actual market price and instead focusing on making appealing games for the gamers out there, which they would end up buying. And because of that strategy, in the end, the PlayStation 3 became a huge success. It had humongous amounts of exclusives from about 2008, early 2009 onwards, from Killzone 2, Metal Gear, Uncharted, Last of Us. There is a humongous library, and this is something that Google Stadia does not yet have, but it is something that Google can do. The thing that differentiates Google from the aforementioned OnLive and Gaikai is the fact that Google has size. And this is called economies of scale. They have the money to invest and make up for their other failures. So even though this initial draft of the Stadia is rough, they have a monetary advantage as well as a technological advantage. And what I mean by a technological advantage is that the Stadia is a streaming device. So all of the technical improvements to decrease load on your hardware, to improve the bitrate, to make sure that people with worse internet connections can still get a decent experience by reducing image quality, improving their algorithms for image quality, etc., etc. Those things Google can do on their own side without the consumer having to buy some kind of extension. This is something that really hasn't been possible before. This is not something that Sony and Microsoft could do as much. They were mostly limited to patches to the software, but the games themselves, that is, rather than improving the hardware. And that is something that Google Stadia can do. And they have the money to make it happen, something that OnLive and Gaikai did not have. This makes a huge difference. And this brings me to the point of this video. What I want to make clear with this video is that I am convinced that Google Stadia isn't going to fail because of hardware issues. I think Google has some of the deepest pockets on the planet. They will improve their software and they will improve the way that you receive your games. They will improve the gaming experience, and I'm also convinced that they will find ways to lower the actual input latency, to bring it in closer to console standards, if not PC standards. This is all a matter of time and effort, and as internet infrastructure improves, so will the capabilities of Stadia improve as well. However, what can end up killing Stadia is a lack of community. And I think this is why the actual pricing of Stadia is more problematic as compared to the software quality, what they're delivering right now. What you're seeing in games like Destiny 2, which is kind of the big flagship for the Google Stadia, the one game that offers 60 frames per second as compared to its console counterparts. This game already has problems with its own matchmaking, where it takes quite a while because the community just isn't there. And because of the current size of multiplayer gaming in the market and how important multiplayer gaming is, what you'll find is that games will become boring much more easily, much earlier. There aren't that many single player games released on the market anymore. Mostly this is done by Sony these days, and every now and then a game from a different publisher comes out that is also single player oriented, like the very recently released Star Wars game by Respawn Studios, which did very well. But Stadia does not have these games yet, so Stadia has to rely on its multiplayer while it is still having new games developed for it. And at the moment Stadia does not do a very good job of that. Stadia suffers because these old games that they have, like Tomb Raider and whatnot, are simply overpriced. I don't believe that a lot of people are willing to invest in the premium subscription model so that they can get a small discount on Google Stadia for these older games, which are much cheaper, found on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, and as well as the PC. So where is the investment worth coming from? Where does the gamer get their value from? There is value in being able to stream onto your telephone and your laptop, but is this worth the price of admission? Is it worth paying big bucks to become a premium member and then paying for the games again? I don't think that is true at the moment. I think there is where Stadia has to put in real work, where Google has to really invest to make sure that the Stadia is affordable, where the subscription model is clear to the consumer, because I do think there are still some ambiguities to the subscription model. It's not communicated well enough to people, and I also think that Google needs to get rid of this founder's pack idea and just make sure that people can buy the premium subscription fee from the actual home menu, whichever entry version of Google Stadia you buy. It should not be a founder's edition thing. That's kind of ridiculous. So let me give my final thoughts here. I am strongly opinionated on the fact that streaming is the future. I think it is inevitable. Fact is that once the internal infrastructure within Sony and Microsoft and whatnot is good enough, it is much cheaper for them to just have gamers stream games as compared to creating physical hardware, these boxes that we're used to and these consoles as we see them now. These are a temporary thing that will get removed. The real question is, when will that happen? When will we only be able to download games digitally? When will we only be able to stream games digitally? Some people are saying that the generation after the PlayStation 5 will be the one to be stream only. I think there is a reasonable argument for that. I think that is fairly believable. However, if you look at the actual internet connectivity globally, yes, more than 50% of people buy their games digitally now on the PlayStation 4, but is that the market that Sony and Microsoft want to go for well into the future? I am not entirely convinced of that. I think that if Sony and Microsoft want to keep on earning more money, expand their actual user base, they will have to expand to territories which traditionally have had worse infrastructure. You know, you have countries like Brazil, which has not just stricter laws, but also has notably worse infrastructure. You have countries like the Philippines, where it is one of those few Asian countries that doesn't really have that big of a gaming market. Even though this is a country that speaks English rather well, games should do very well in the Philippines, but the internet infrastructure isn't there. So to make your console internet reliable, I don't think it's a very good idea. I think that the backlash of the Xbox One during its early campaign in 2013 has already showed the market response towards being digital only. And I realize that 2013 will not compare to our infrastructure after the PlayStation 5 generation. But I am also convinced that streaming will already be a big part of the PlayStation 5. It will not be the only factor. I am convinced that the PlayStation 5 will still have physical discs. I am convinced that the PlayStation 5 will have an internal hard drive, as the specs have already released. And because of that, downloading games and installing them onto your SSD will become the standard of the PlayStation 5. But I also think that Sony is intending to use their acquired Gaikai technology, which now powers PlayStation Now, to power a bigger streaming service on the PlayStation 5 in the future. I think that this has already been more or less confirmed by Sony, as they said that they wanted to be a pioneer in the streaming market. This is important as it indicates their business strategy. Very recently, some heads of Sony have started to leave the company. Not just Adam Boyes, but also some other heads which used to be big on physical media, which means that the push for digital media has only become bigger for Sony. And this is again a strong indicator of how the market will change. But what I do wish for, what I hope for, is that the device after the PlayStation 5, whether it be called PlayStation 6 or whatever, still respects the market that has not yet been conquered. I really believe that when it comes to profitability, it is better to make sure that your system can expand outward to other countries that have not yet become big on gaming, rather than only focusing on the market that already exists and then force them into acquiring better internet subscriptions. Not all of the people who play on a PlayStation 4 or PC or an Xbox One currently have very strong internet connections, and not all of them can afford to stream games. So for that reason, streaming would probably be more intelligent as the primary way to play games in the next generation, sure, but not the only way. And that is my thought on streaming as of yet. I think that Google Stadia will do fine. I think that Google Stadia has a rough start, but it's not the only one. So did the PlayStation 3, so did the Xbox One throughout this entire generation. So really, people calling Stadia dead right now, I think they are speaking prematurely. I think they do not understand just how deep the pockets of Google will go, and they have most definitely planned something out for this coming decade already. This is not an investment of, oh, let's put the hardware on the market, and if it underperforms, we'll drop it immediately. That's not how Google works. They are going to invest into their Stadia platform and make sure it is the best it can be, because they know that they have competition coming from Sony and Microsoft both. So they will want to be top of the market. They will invest. They will probably reconsider their price points, their price structures rather soon. I imagine that they will also push for sales more often to make games more affordable, like this Christmas probably already. And I think that Google Stadia will become more relevant as time goes on. Thank you for watching. If you would like to see more videos from me, then subscribe, leave a comment, I will reply, and y'all have a good day.